Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello to all the panelists. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Page, welcome back. Very nice to see you again. I'd like to start with you. Very interesting comments. One of the things you mentioned was about austerity and the impact of austerity measures on economic growth and on our sustainability. Can you describe for us what is the impact of the government's austerity measures? Because the government, of course, does want to make sure its finances are in order, but is there a downside, or can you describe the downside to austerity measures?
Thank you. Mr. Chair, actually, I think the way economists tend to look at austerity is very similar to really the mirror image to the way we looked at stimulus. So in the case of stimulus, when the government implemented a very large stimulus package in 2009, they used economic analysis, effectively what we call multipliers, to estimate what would be, if we had a stimulus package, what would be the additional increase in output, what would be the additional increase in jobs. And they calculated, with a stimulus package in the neighborhood of $50 billion, that we could achieve an additional 2 percentage points to GDP and an additional a couple 100,000 jobs. In 2012, the government moved forward to freeze direct program spending effectively for 5 years. Something in the neighborhood, direct program spending is in the neighborhood of $115, $120 billion. So we're reducing effectively spending by almost $15 billion over that period of time from what its trend growth rate was. So again, you're talking about loss overall since 2012, probably something in the neighborhood of 1 percentage point in terms of output and 100,000 jobs. Again, this is taking place in a time where our economy is operating below potential. We have unemployment rates in the 7% range. We have capacity utilization rates, in the 80% range. This is, these are, different rates what existed prior to the recession. So there are costs to austerity, just as there were positive benefits to stimulus.
Now, austerity, as you described, is a drag on our economic growth. And Mr. MacDonald, you talked about the slow growth and the lack of growth is really one of our major problems. We have trade deficits. You talked about the collapse of the manufacturing sector, stagnating wages, and yet so much of our recovery seems to depend on consumer spending, which is translated increasingly into high personal debt. How sustainable is this in the long run, or even in the short run?
Looking at the debt levels of households, we have seen some leveling off in terms of the increasing household debt, although that is picking up again in the last year. In terms of debt sustainability, clearly the sector that's most over-leveraged in the Canadian economy is clearly households. And this isn't news to this committee, and it's not news to folks at the Bank of Canada or to economists in general that have been highlighting the issue of high household debt. In the short term, it may well be sustainable given historically low interest rates and, importantly, historically low mortgage rates. That a lot of this debt, the vast majority of the debt, in fact, is mortgage debt. It's not debt from buying household items, computers and TVs and so on. And so in the short term, it may well be sustainable, given that the mortgage payments are quite low. The real problem that it presents is that it is leveraged up the household sector, and changes in the mortgage rate going forward will have a much bigger impact on the household sector than it would have had the household sector had lower rates of indebtedness. And so that's the real concern, is that when and if economic growth begins again and we do see mortgage rates start to climb up, again, they're at historic lows, that's the real danger, is that an over-leveraged household sector cuts back on its spending. It has been the primary driver of economic growth, and we see a real drag on growth once we start to see some pickup.
Follow up. You talked about that right now we're in a period of a very slow growth, and the government's austerity measures are designed to get us to a balanced budget situation quite quickly. Now, one of the things the government has said it wants to do if we get to a balanced budget situation is introduce income splitting. Is that a good idea for Canada?
Well, income splitting would act against the government's goals of reducing its debt more rapidly, if that is the government's goal. Income splitting is relatively expensive. It's in the neighborhood of $2.5 to $3 billion a year at the federal level. It's about half that at the provincial level from studies that have been done previously. And so it would be quite expensive. What that would mean is that if the government wants to maintain its path towards balanced budget in a certain year, say 2015-16, they'd have to cut those expenditures someplace else out of the budget to make room for this tax expenditure of income splitting.
Thank you.